Hello everybody and welcome to today's session on visualizing the vaccination data. Today we're going to be looking at an article that was done by the Wall Street Journal on vaccinations, and we're going to look at that visual and look at potentially ways in which we can improve upon it. We're going to look at which states were particularly affected by the various different diseases, and in this we're going to be introducing some of the external tools. So we'll be introducing two today, but during that first part we'll be introducing Tabular Editor. And the second thing we're going to do is we're going to look at a method for creating dynamic confidence intervals. And when we do that, we're then going to be looking at using Dak Studio. So I'm just going to flip over to the Wall Street Journal article. And as always, you'll be able to access all of the files that you use today in the link below. So this is the article by the Wall Street Journal on battling infectious diseases in the 20th century. So you can notice here we've got a lot of different diseases. So we've got measles, hepatitis A, mumps, whooping cough, and we've got polio, and we've got a few more diseases down here. So these visualizations have actually got a list of states down here on the left-hand side. So they've got a list of all the different states, and then they've got a list of all the different years along here from left to right. So you can see that. So that's how the visuals are laid out. And then we've got here an indication of how many cases of diseases, and we can see here that there's much more of a cluster prior to the vaccination being introduced here than there was sort of after the vaccination was introduced. So it's a very sort of interesting way of visualizing the data. However, that's not to say that it's not without criticisms, and we're going to look at a couple of those. So the first one is it's got this diverging color scale. And the second one is it's quite difficult because of the ordering of the states to say which state was most affected by polio in this instance. So if I asked you, which state has actually had the worst cases in terms of polio, just by looking at that, I think you'd find it quite difficult to provide an answer. OK, so I'm just going to pop back to the slides and I'm just going to show you about those states particularly affected. So as I mentioned, we've got this colour scheme that's currently going on that goes from blue to green to yellow to orange and then finally across to red. And obviously that's really difficult for us to compute all those different colours. Lots of people quite intuitively, depending on which culture you're from, you'll think green is better than blue, but not in the instance of this colour scale. And again, I mentioned about the alphabetical order there. It's very difficult to see which states have performed better, and I've just taken a little snapshot here. OK, so we're going to then now create a visual within Power BI and see what we can do. Before I do that, however, I'd like to show you what the data looks like, and then we'll go ahead. So I'm just going to look at the data within a Excel file. So it's actually in CSV format, but I've opened it up in Excel. So within this data, we have a list of all the different states, a list of all the different diseases. We then have it across all the different years. And for number of incidents, we've got the number of incidents for every 100,000 individual. And the reason we do that is it's not fair to compare across different states if you look at it in just in raw number of cases, because if you think of somewhere like Alaska compared to the population of California, there's obviously going to be a lot more cases in California just by the number of people, but doesn't mean California has necessarily done worse at controlling it. The final column I've got here is one that I've just manually added, and that includes whether the vaccine has been introduced or not. So I've just got a 1 or a 0, so a binary there. So 1 if the vaccine's been introduced and 0 if it hasn't. OK, so I'm just going to close that down and I'm going to pop over to Power BI. Nope, don't see any changes. And if we open up our Power BI, the first thing we're going to do, as always, is we're just going to connect to our data. So as I mentioned, the data that we're looking at is CSV. So if we go get data and then we go text CSV, we can then connect to our data, and it's called vaccination data. So if I just double click on that, and as always, I get this kind of preview of my data. And as always, we don't just load data in, we click transform data, and we actually have a look at our data within the query editor just to check that it has been brought through correctly. If you load it in, then you can find yourself in trouble if the data hasn't been brought in correctly. But actually, in this instance, it all looks fine. So for instance, we've got all of our headers that we looked at actually within our headers in our query editor. We can also see that the data types look sensible as well. So we've got ABC, which is type text for a disease, and obviously the diseases are all text. However, for whether the number of incidents per 100,000, that is as a numerical number, and we can see these are all numbers. So that looks correct and it looks good. So from here, let's go and let's load our data in by going up here to the top left hand side and clicking close and apply. Great, so we're now just loading our data into the model. And actually the first thing I'm going to do before I do any kind of creating any visualizations on the page is I'm going to introduce a background. So if we go over here to the formatting pane and to page background, so formatting and then page background, I'm going to add in an image. And again, all of this is within the notes and the comments below. The first background we're going to use is called affected states. So I'm just going to double click on that, and that's going to produce a background on the page. However, as you may have noticed, those of you who are more astute, it hasn't done that. And that's because the transparency is set to 100% and the image is actually just normal where we want to get it to fit onto the page. So if we change the image to fit and we reduce the transparency to 0%, we can now see our background. And every time you introduce a background, Power BI will automatically set the transparency to 100%. So you always need to remember to do this. Okay, so if we can just remind ourselves of what the Wall Street Journal visualization looked like, we had all the states down one axis and all the years across the others, and we're actually going to use the matrix visual here in order to create that view. So if we just select that matrix visual, and I'm just going to drag it down slightly more, fill up about half the page, because I actually want to look at a different type of visualization as well. For this, I'm actually going to look at a single disease, and the disease we're going to look at is going to be polio. So if we just go filter, and I'm going to filter everything on this page, so everything on page 1, let's just look at polio to start with. So with polio, I'm going to put the states on the rows, and I'm going to put the calendar years across all the different columns. So at this point, I could either drop in the number of incidents per 100,000 onto the values, or I could create a new measure by going new measure up here. However, what I'm going to do today is I'm going to introduce an external tool, and we're going to create this measure within Tabular Editor. So those of you who've got the most recent version of Power BI, if you go to External Tools and Tabular Editor, and let's select Tabular Editor. We will get this warning message pop up. It's an experimental feature. We're just going to ignore that for now, and we're going to plow ahead. Okay, so this is now opened up Tabular Editor, and if we just expand out here on the left hand side, and I just zoom in a little bit for you, what you can see is that we do have our vaccination data, and we have all of those columns of data that we were bringing in. So we can actually see that this is connected to our Power BI model. And what we're now going to do is we're going to create a measure in Tabular Editor, and that's going to write it back to Power BI for us. Okay, so if we go right click, create new and measure, we are now going to be creating a new measure. And the measure that we're going to create is just going to be really simply, and I'm just going to increase the size of this for you to see, it's just going to be the sum of the number of incidents for every 100,000 people per location. And I'm just going to close off the brackets there. And the only other thing that I'm going to do is currently it's called new measure. You can see name new measure here. I'm just going to double click on new measure, and I'm going to rename it something slightly more sensible. So if we call it number of incidents 100,000. I've put per 10,000 there. Just add an extra 0. Okay, so you can see, there we go. I've just changed the name down there in the bottom corner. So now let's just go save, or go file, save. And if we go back to our Power BI model, that measure should now be available. So if we go back, and very fortunately, there we go. We now have this measure, number of incidents per 100,000 within our Power BI model. So let's just take that and drag that onto the values. And now we have a list of all of the different states and a list of all the different years, and then we just have a number within each of the cells, and we're actually going to change that round. But we also need to remove these totals that we've got as well. So let's do a little bit of formatting just to make this look a bit clearer. So on the formatting pane, we're just going to click on subtotals, and we're going to turn them off for rows and for columns. There we have it. We have no subtotals on our report now. And secondly, what we're going to do is we're going to go down to conditional formatting, and we're going to change the background color of all the different numbers. And we're also going to change the font color to be the same. And I'm just going to use a single color. There we go. And now you can see that we've started to create a similar visual to the one we saw before with a single tone color scheme. So if we go up to home, I'm just going to put a line on the chart just to indicate that we've got the vaccine introduced. So I'm just going to go shape, a line shape, and I'm just going to drag that onto 1955, which is when the vaccination for polio took place, and change the color to black. So there we have it. Now, obviously, in the notes, I've made this a bit clearer, but you can now hopefully see that we have a similar visual to the Wall Street Journal with this sort of single tone color scheme. What we can also do is we can now just reorder this. So if we go sort by number of incidents per 100,000, just remove some of the rows here. What we can see is that South Dakota, Nebraska and Iowa all had the highest number of cases. So there we go. So that quite clearly then overcomes the problem, is that it provides the state detail, but also the state detail has some meaning behind it. If we just pop back to the Wall Street Journal visualization and we look very carefully down here, we can see sort of two red blocks. And if we hover over, we see that's South Dakota S.D. So there we go. So we know that's the highest. It's very hard to tell from this visual. So it's very visually appealing in some respects, but also it's quite hard to extract the information that we might want. Okay, the second thing I'm going to do is this type of visual has one major limitation when we're dealing with diseases, and that's that diseases are totally not bothered by boundaries. Okay, so what we might want to do is we might want to look at, neighbouring states. Did they have a similar problem in a similar year? And a map visual will tell us that story. Whereas this type of visual, unless you have a very sort of solid geographical understanding of where every state is, you won't be able to achieve that. So if we just copy this visual, and I'm just going to do the standard Control-C, Control-V, just to create a copy of that visual, and I'm going to drag it over here to the right-hand side. I'm then just going to select a shape map visual. In fact, actually, let's do shape map visual, and let's pick a year. So if we go calendar year, and I'm just going to select 1951. At the moment, it's all coming through in one color. That's because I've got calendar year on the legend selected. So I'm just going to close that out. There we go. And now we have a map visual for polio in 1951. And this tells us a bit more about the story, because it shows quite clearly that we've got these three states here within 1951, which all had a high number of cases per 100,000 people. If you just hover over, you can see what states those are. Okay, and that would make sense. We'd expect that states clustered together would have a similar number of cases. Okay, so that's sort of one way of visualizing the vaccination data. What we're now going to go over to is we're going to look at how we could potentially use confidence intervals and the mean in order to aggregate and look at lots of diseases at the same time. So at the moment, we're just looking at one disease at a time, and it takes up quite a lot of real estate on our page. But what we could do is we could combine all of these states together and use a mean and give ourselves confidence intervals based on the number of cases between the different states. So if I just flip over to my visual that I've pre-created just to show you what this looks like. So here we have, and this is what we're now going to build out. So what we have here is we have the impact of vaccines. You can see I've got polio, rubella, smallpox, measles, hepatitis A, whooping cough and mumps. I've got them all selected, and what I've got is I've got the mean average as a black line here, and I've got this orange dotted line showing the confidence intervals. And if I hover over, I can see what the worst state was. I've got a little map, and I've got an upper and lower confidence interval. And what I've also got here on the right hand side is the user can select the confidence interval that they want. So I've got 90% selected at the moment, and you can see that here and here. But the user could also then select, for instance, 95%, and you'll see that the graphs will change and the confidence level down here will also change. There we go. The other thing about this visual is you can see the grey area, which is the post-vaccine, and the white area, which is pre-vaccine. So you can see quite clearly when the vaccine came into play. So let's go about building this. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create the mean, and then we're going to bring in the rest of the confidence intervals, which will require some more complicated DAX. And for that, we'll use Dak Studio, which is always the tool which I go to whenever I have to write some DAX, which is of intermediate to very complex. Okay, so let's go back to our data. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to import a new set of data, which contains all of the formulas, all the calculations that I'm going to need. And then we'll build the formulas off that. So if we go get data again, text CSV, and this time we'll use the vaccination mean and standard deviation. You'll notice in the notes I've also got the state populations, which you'll need if you want to do any kind of calculations yourself. But we won't actually be looking at it in the session. So if we just bring in the vaccination mean and standard deviation table, and I'm going to go again just to transform data once we get our data preview up. And again, this is going to open up our query editor. So here we have our query editor, and we have a lot of very similar fields to what we had last time. So we've got the disease, we've also got the calendar year, and we've got the number of rows, which is going to be the N in our formula, and that's just the number of states. And then we have the mean number of cases per 100,000, and we also have a standard deviation, which is an indication of variance. And finally, we have the flag again, for whether it's been introduced or not. So let's take that and let's load that into our model. Great, so we're now just loading that data into our model, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new page here. And on this new page, I'm going to create the visual for polio to start with. So we're going to stick with the same disease, but then obviously we can replicate it out for all the other ones. So in order to do that, I'm going to use this line in stacked column chart, and I'm just going to drag it to fill up the entire page. So we've got a line in stacked column chart, and we're just getting it to take up the entire page for now, just so it's visible. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to put the calendar year on the shared axis. We're going to put the disease, and we're going to just have it for this visual, and we're going to select a single selection, and it's going to be polio. All right, and now we're just going to drag the mean number of cases onto the line values. What we're going to do though is we're not going to do this within our Power BI. Again, I'm just going to take you back to Tabular Editor, and we will do it in there. So if we go back to Tabular Editor, got two different instances of it. So, okay, let's just close both of them down, and let's open up Tabular Editor from beginning. So external tools, Tabular Editor, and again, warning message. Again, we're going to ignore it. So let's just bring it up, tables, and this time I'm going to select the second table, vaccination mean and standard deviation, and I'm going to create the mean number of cases, which is just going to be the sum of the mean number of cases. Okay, well, let's just reduce the size of that slightly. There we go. So we've got the mean number of cases, and again, I'm just going to change the name of this. Oh, sorry, made a mistake there. Apologies. So if we just go right click, create new measure, and that's going to be the sum of the mean number of cases for every 100,000, and we're going to call that new measure the mean. Okay, let's just save that down, and there we have it. We have the mean within our Power BI model here on the right hand side. So let's take that and drop that onto our line values. So there we have it with the mean number of cases going through for all the different years. So that's the relatively straightforward piece. The more complicated piece we're now going to do in Dak Studio, and that's going to be creating those confidence intervals above and below this line. Now the way we're going to do that is we are going to first open up our Dak Studio external tool. We're going to look at an individual disease and year, and we're going to create it for that, but we're going to build it in such a way where it's expandable for all diseases and years. So let's open up Dak Studio and let that come through. So Dak Studio, very much like Tabular Editor, we can see down here on the left hand side that we've got our data already brought in for us. Whenever we're in here and we're doing a table, we need to just use this evaluate. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to evaluate and I'm going to drag over the entire table. This is really just to show you what it looks like. So if I evaluate the entire table, Dak Studio very kindly gives me an output of the entire table. So really nice and simple. What I'm going to want to do though is I'm going to want to reduce this table so it's just a single disease and a single year. And I'm going to use something called filter in order to do that. So if I put filter this and I filter this by the disease, and let's call the disease polio, and I need to close my brackets out there, and I click run up here in the top left hand side again, you'll now notice that it's returned a table of just polio. Let's improve upon this slightly and just get back to a single disease and a single year. And if we go and this time we do the calendar year, let's drag that over, and the year equals, let's do 1948. And there we have it. We have a single disease for a single year, which we have filtered out. It's a very handy thing that Dak Studio does. You can see I've formatted as I've gone along, but you can actually use this format query button as well, which will format your DAX for you and make it a lot prettier, which is really important. In order to read DAX, you need to make it correctly formatted. So there we go. So that's one way of doing it. Now, the important thing to bear in mind here is the more advanced of you will know that DAX contains two different contexts whenever you use it. So there's evaluation context and there's two different ones. There's a filter context, which is applied before your report, before your DAX statement is evaluated. So your DAX statement is evaluated within the filter context, and the other context is the row context. And this is basically an iterative context. Sorry, spelling is terrible there. So that basically iterates through every single row within a table and returns a value. Now, what you have to bear in mind with the formula that I've used here, filter, is you would assume that that applies a filter context. In fact, it doesn't. It applies a row context. What it's doing is it's iterating through every single row in this table and then filtering out where it finds polio and where it finds 1948. So it's called filter, but it's not changing the filter context, it's changing the row context. Okay, so we now have our filter. Now what we're going to do is we're going to add a column for our confidence intervals. So I'm just going to use add columns for that. I'm just going to space this out. So I'm adding a column to a table which is defined by this filter, and that column is going to be called confidence. So with confidence selected, how am I going to calculate my confidence? Well, fortunately, I've already got the formula within the notes. So if I just go to the notes and I just show you the formula. So the formula is just here on the right hand side, and we're going to start off with a fixed confidence interval, and then we'll make that confidence interval dynamic at a later point in time. So the element we're going to need to do is we've got the mean plus or minus this confidence formula, which is our Z score times, our Z value times by our standard deviation divided by the square root of n. And we're going to use a fixed Z to start with, which is going to be 1.96, which indicates a 95% confidence level. So that formula is 1.96 times the standard deviation divided by the square root of n. And that will give us our plus and our minus from the mean in terms of us being 95% confident. So let's go back to Dak Studio and let's write this out. So I'm just going to give myself a little bit of extra space here in order to do this, and I'm just going to actually add a close bracket as well there because I'm going to need to close off my my add columns. So the first thing we're going to need to do is the 1.96, and secondly I'm just going to select, and I'm just going to use the max just to return the value, and we're going to have a problem here, which is why I explained the context earlier on. Let's just do the max of the standard deviation. So in lots of ways you might expect this to be returning just a single value, the max, and it just being the max for this individual row. However, that's not going to be the case, but let's just do it for now. So let's do the max, and we also need to then divide that by the square root of n. Now I could use divide, but actually within Power BI we have this safe divide, which deals with anything when you divide by 0 and create an error. So our safe divide, which is done like this, divide, and we just use a comma there, and let's do the square root of the max, and I need the number of rows, so that's my n. So close both of those out, and there we go. I'm just going to format it just to make it a bit prettier. So 1.96 times by the max of the standard deviation divided by the square root of n. Okay. So I've now run that, and at the bottom you can see Polio 1948. You can see the mean, which is 18.1. You can see the standard deviation, and the confidence interval given me is really, really high. It's saying 74.56. So what that's saying is that we are 95% confident that it could be as high as 92, so 18 plus 74, which seems a really high confidence range for this individual row. And the reason it's doing this is to do with the evaluation context. So what's happening here is, although we're looking at an individual row, the filter context still includes every single row within this table. But we can convert a row context to a filter context using something called context transition. And we do that by using calculate. And this is converting the row context to a filter context. And if we increase this in calculate and now run it, what you'll notice is that confidence interval has gone down to a much more plausible 6.79. So there we go. So it's 18 plus 6.79 rather than 18 plus 74, I think it was. So there you go. So that's how why you need to be really careful when using filter, because it uses a row context. Okay, so we actually can't save back to our Power BI model from here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy this formula and I'm going to create it within Power BI in the usual manner. So I'm going to copy back, and I'm just going to do, in fact, let's use Tabular Editor just to sort of show how that works. So let's keep using Tabular Editor to create our measures. So on the left hand side here, vaccination mean and standard deviation, let's right click, create new measure, and this new measure, let's just paste that in, which we copied from Dak Studio, and let's call that confidence. There we go. So that's our confidence. And now let's create our upper and our lower boundaries. So if I just save that, we can see in Power BI our confidence has appeared. But now what we need to do is add our upper and lower boundaries, and all that we're going to do is we're going to take that confidence, but we're also going to use the mean. So we're going to use the mean, and we're going to subtract the confidence for the lower boundary, and we're going to add the confidence for the upper boundary. I'm just going to call that lower and upper. So if we just do create new measure, and this is just going to be the mean that we've got plus our confidence, and it's going to be called upper. Just change the name down here in the bottom again. And I'm going to create another new measure, and that's going to be the mean subtracting the confidence, and we're going to call that the lower down there. And let's just save that. And if you go back to our Power BI model, there we go. We can see we have lower and upper within our Power BI model. And I can now drag that onto the canvas, onto my line values. So we drag lower and we drag upper, we now have 3 lines in our data, and it's not formatted very well at this point. And remember, the confidence intervals are still fixed. I've not made them dynamic yet. But in the middle, we've got our mean value, and then we've got our upper, and we have our lower value there as well. So we're going to do a little bit of formatting in order to make this look a bit more presentable. The first thing we'll do before we do that, however, is I'm going to drop on this vaccine has been introduced flag into our column values. And this is the first instance we've shown today of creating what's known as a implicit measure. So normally what we've been doing today is we've been explicitly defining what our measures are. In this instance, we've just dragged and dropped it onto our column values, and Power BI has sort of inferred what it thinks it is, and it said, oh, this is a number, I'm going to sum it up. So there we have it. We have whether our vaccine's been introduced, and we can see that 1955, which I showed you earlier, was the year, and we can see all the other years since then. Obviously, we had the vaccine in place. So let's do our formatting now. So let's go over to our formatting pane. And I'm just going to do a few tweaks. I'm not going to go too crazy, but you can look at the PBIX file if you want to see exactly how I've done it. So I'm just going to take off the legend. When it comes to the shapes, let's change around the colors. So in fact, let's do data colors first. So we've got our lower boundaries. Let's make that amber, and our upper colors the same, upper boundary the same color. Let's change the mean to being black. And what I'm going to do is I'm also going to change the default color of whether the vaccine's been introduced to this kind of lightish gray color. With the shapes selected, what I'm going to do is, rather than change them all, I'm going to customize each series individually. And the reason I'm going to do this is I want to put dashed lines for my upper and lower confidence. So if I choose line style dashed for lower and with upper selected, so I've just selected upper, I do exactly the same thing. And that makes it a lot clearer for me to see the mean value and my upper and my lower boundaries. Okay, so there's obviously a whole host of other things that I could do here to make this look a bit more presentable. So with the x-axis selected, I'm actually going to make this a categorical, which is ruined the sort order. So let's just change the sort order by going here and sorting it, ascending it again. There we go, it's back to how it was. But what I can do now with it, I can change the inner padding to 0%, so they make it overlap each other, so we can see a kind of a grey area for after the vaccine and a white area for before the vaccine. It just kind of makes it a bit easier to see. The only other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take off the title for the x-axis. Let's do that. And on the y-axis, let's change the position to right, because we want the numbers here on the left hand side. And let's just make the other color white and turn off all the titles again for the heading. So let's do that. I've also still got an overall title up here at the top. Don't really like that, so let's get rid of that. And let's just, we don't need a background either. Okay, so that's our polio disease with a static confidence interval. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce a background like I did before and line up all the different visuals. So if we go visualization, and like we did before, we're just going to choose format and page background. And this time we're going to select the other background in the notes, which is going to be all diseases. And as before, just remember image fit, transparency, remember to change them over. So fit and transparency. There we have it. Now we have a page with all our diseases on. So I'm just going to drag polio up here, and I'm just going to make copies of this. So I need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 copies. Okay. And let's just drag them down into their various different boxes. So instead of using titles, I've used a background, and I really like using backgrounds in order to lay out your reporting. And obviously you can see all the formatting changes I've done in the final PBIX version in the notes. So there we have it. We have all of our various different diseases all lined up. Obviously they're all pointing towards polio at the moment, so let's just change them over. So on the filter, let's just change the disease name. And smallpox, measles, hepatitis A, whooping cough, and finally, let's just select mumps. So there we have it. We have something similar to the visual that I showed you. I've not laid it out quite as cleanly, and obviously if I was doing this for a client, you'd spend a bit more time lining everything up. What I'm now going to do is create those dynamic confidence intervals, and I'm going to do this using a disconnected table, so a table completely disconnected from the model. So if we go back to our confidence intervals, you'll see here I've got a list of the Z values and their corresponding confidences. This is just taken from a table based on normal distribution. So let's add in that disconnected table manually. So if we go back to Power BI and we go home, we can just enter the data that we require in. So enter data, and let's just manually type this in. So let's start with confidence, and let's put our Z here. So our confidences are going to be 90%, 95%, and 99%, and they're going to be 1.64, 1.96, and 2.58, I believe. 1.64, 1.96, and 2.58. So that's fine. And I'm just going to change the table name to being confidence. So even though as well I've done this myself, I'm still going to go into edit and look at it within the query editor to check it all looks right. So this is now again back into our query editor, and it's picked up a percentage and a numerical number for my two different data types. I'm actually going to change the confidence to a text just to help out with the users. So because this is going to be what they're going to select. So I'm just going to have that as 90% because I'm not going to be doing anything mathematical with this at all. So that's my confidence table brought through. Let's close and apply, and let's bring that data back into Power BI. Great, so that's happened. And just to prove to you that the table is entirely disconnected from our model, you can see that confidence is sat here completely on its own. There's no connection to the rest of the model. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that confidence and I'm going to take it and I'm going to drag it onto filter for this page, and I'm going to select a single confidence such as 90%. I'm also going to introduce a card visual at this point. So if I click on the card visual, what I can do is I can drag confidence onto this field, and it lets the user know what confidence that they have selected. Again, we're going to do a little bit of formatting, and basically for this I'm just going to turn everything off except for, in fact I'm going to just change the data label size as well to, let's do it to 20 points, it's half it and a bit. So there we have it, we have a 90% confidence, and it's clear to the user that that's what they've got selected within the filters. All right, so now we need to do the bit where we actually change the formula. So if we go back to our confidence, you remember hopefully that we had 1.96 as a fixed value within our confidence. We're now going to change this over to be the selected value that they've got for the confidence on the page. And because I've got it so they've got a single selection, I'm just going to quite lazily just use max, and I'm just going to choose the max of the Z, because I know I've only got one value selected at a time, and I'm now going to bring it into that formula. Great, so that's the formula itself actually changed. Instead of being a fixed static Z, we've now got it as a dynamic. So if we choose our different confidence intervals, it will now, the graphs will now all change. So I've got 90% selected at the moment, and if I select 95%, you'll see that the confidence intervals have changed. So that's a way that you can introduce confidence intervals into your Power BI model. I'll make sure require single selection, otherwise you will find yourself in trouble. So there you go. So that's how you can use dynamic confidence intervals within Power BI. I hope that's been of help for you, and I hope you can join us next time we do an event. Thank you very much.